I would like to thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today. And I will also want to thank my previous speaker for doing his lecture, because it sort of brings back to what I'm going to talk about. This specifically is cannabis in heroin or opiate addiction. When we talk about cannabis in medicine, we talk usually about a cure or palliative treatment. And here we talk on something a bit different. It's a substitution treatment. As you know, when we talk about cannabis, we talk mainly about CB1 and CB2 receptors. When we talk about the CNS, you have mostly CB1 receptors. And when talking about heroin, we talk about two kinds of receptors, mu and lambda. CB1 is much more prevalent in the brain than the mu receptors or the lambda receptors. The mu are much more proliferative, lambda is less. And it has a specific allosteric situation that changes the response to those receptors. And that's the reason why we have begun research on using cannabis as a substitution therapy. Now you must remember that the problem with heroin or other opiates, not only heroin, also drug-based like OxyContin and things, is that eventually a lot of people die from OD, overdose, because it stops in the brainstem, it stops your breathing complex and you stop breathing and you die. In the US, for instance, they're talking now about the opiate epidemics. Thank you. The opiate epidemics. But before we start, I want to say a word of caution, especially in this place. When we talk about cannabis, we say it's not dangerous. Cannabis by itself, it's not dangerous. But there has been a research on FA, fatty amino acid hydroxylase. It's an enzyme that generates anandamide and works within the endocannabinoid system. And because of that drug, I think it was done in France, this study, and it was done by Albi, 6 people ended with brain problems in the hospital. One is considered brain dead, which means it's not exactly no danger at all. And again, when we talk about using cannabis, remember that we don't use cannabis alone, especially in recreational cannabis. There's the problem of drinking and cannabis, driving and cannabis. So we have a lot of problems that we have to work with. But again, when we talk about the receptors, we must remember that apart from the CB1, CB2 receptors, cannabis works on a variety of other receptors which are not specifically to the endocannabinoid system. And part of them was the TRPV, the vanilloic receptors, which work in various places in the body, like the skin, but here we are talking about the CNS, and of course the serotonin, like my former presenter said about the 5-hydroxytryptamine number 3 receptors, which are very important. I'm skipping about this because it has been talked about a lot. So we'll move on to my next slide, which shows the various endocannabinoids and phytocannabinoids that we are working with. The degradation of the cannabinoid is very important, because when working with heroin specifically, but most of the opiates, the degradation takes longer time within the system, which means you can use less cannabis to get the same effect. Remember that the effect here is not getting high. The effect here is not using heroin or not using other opiate medication. Okay, so you can use very low, well, considerably lower concentrates of cannabis to get the same effect. And lastly, concerning the endocannabinoid system, I would like to mention that the problem working with cannabis from a research point of view is that there are many cannabinoids, and there are other parts of the plants which are biologically active, like terpenes, and all of them are synergistic, what we call the entourage effect. So we can't usually work with pure CBD, pure THC, doesn't matter if we make it in a lab or get it from an extract, but using only pure substrates is usually less, we have less results. And here we go to the point of what we're trying to say here. When we checked, or when it has been checked, not by me, rats using self-administration of heroin, you can see that when you use CB1 antagonist, we had a reduction in heroin self-administration in high doses. But in slow doses, we had the opposite effect. We know this from using cannabis, especially CBD, because there's a Bell effect. And that's why when we treat patients with cannabis, we have to do it when we updose the dose we give to the patient, we do it very slowly and very carefully, because eventually we'll get to the point where giving more gives us less. And it's not exactly more is better. So we have the same goes for here, and the results that we did on that has been found on heroin has also been found on morphine, which means it's not specific to heroin, but to most opiates that are used in medicine or in recreational. And the conclusion it is that CB1 antagonists may be considered for opiate addiction, but also activation can be beneficial, but only in low dose. Remember that the antagonist worked only in high dose, and in low dose it did the opposite. The opposite is again true for cannabis, which means that if you use low dose of THC, the activation of the CB1 receptors may be beneficial to lowering the addiction to opiates. When talking about CBD, the results are much more interesting because CBD has a much bigger effect on what we are talking. First of all, it's a weak agonist of CB1 receptors, which means you can use larger amounts with no problems. Remember that usually when you treat patient, you use THC in very low doses or low doses, which means up to 100 or even less milligrams a day. And while using CBD, you usually use 300 to 600 milligrams a day, which means the ratio has to be towards more CBD and less THC from the start. As I said, it stimulates the TRPV complex and inhibits the FA, and it's an agonist of the 5-HT1, the serotonin receptor, which is very important in mood relationship or mood homeostatic. And modulates the lambda and mu receptors. All of this is very important when talking about drug addicts because they have mood problems, they have appetite problems, they have sleep problems, beside the addiction and the craving for the drug itself. When you use cannabis, you can treat all those things together in one medication. I'm trying to use the word drug as a negative thing and use medication instead, but of course, clinically, drug and medication are just synonyms. And when you do a research literature on the use of CBD, you can see at least 14 studies which are considered with good quality, showing the synergistic effect of CBD and THC when treating heroin addicts. This is specifically on heroin addicts, and what it did, it reduced the abstinence score, which means there is less craving for the drug, and the abstinence period time is considerably higher when using cannabis. Remember that when treating addicts, substitution therapy is considered adequate. We do it with methadone, we do it with a lot of things, not a lot, few things, naloxone, butyrophenone, and so on. And using cannabis as a substitute therapy has its legal and its ideological points. CBD has an impact on the intoxication and relapse, as I said, but beside that, you can see that the synergistic effect of THC and CBD is much better, not only on heroin, but also on cocaine and amphetamine-induced problems. And again, what I wanted to point out is you usually have to use CBD 10 times as much as THC in the concentration. Because when you use THC, you use 0.5 milligram per kilo, and CBD, you need at least 5 milligrams per kilo. Both cannabinoids potentiate extinction, which means stop using the drug. But the problem after when you stop using the drug is, of course, the craving and the relapse time. And CBD specifically allowed less craving and more of a relapse time as opposed to other things. The main point is that it was not reversed by CB1 antagonists, which means, as we know a lot about cannabis, we all the time speak about CB1 and CB2 receptors, but we know that the cannabis works through other mechanisms, not only through CB1 and CB2 receptors. Whether it's the TRPV, serotonin receptors, or other receptors, we don't know. It has been proposed that there's another third receptor, which is got the name of non-CB1, non-CB2 receptor. CBD, which a lot of people now talking, it's one of the buzzwords in cannabinoid medicine, has other beneficial properties, shall we say, and it's of course anxiolytic, antidepressant, anti-epileptic, as the former presenter said. It reduces pain and prevent hepatotoxicity and even neurotoxicity. All those are very important when treating patients, especially addicts. But the main problem now is not the heroin consumption. I don't know how much you know about specifically abuse of drugs, but the world changes. There are much less heroin users, and there are more, how do you say, drug consumers in Israel. It's called, what is called in English, designer drugs, which are mainly cannabinoids actually, synthetic cannabinoids, or MDMA-based drugs. The synthetic cannabinoids are called, for instance, Mr. Nice Guy is one of the most known one, cause a lot of death, and it's much more potentiated than THC alone, about 100 times more, and that's why it can cause death while THC doesn't. Just a side answer. But where we see the problem today, going back to the opiate problem, is mainly in medications. Most of the people who get addicted to opiates do it under professional prescription. It's what we call iatrogenic, doctors-induced or physician-induced addiction, and it's becoming a major problem. Only a few days ago, Trump in the US declared it's a national emergency. Sorry, he declared, to be precise, short of a national emergency. CBD, apart from all what I said, is also anti-psychotic activity. There's been quite a lot of work that shows it may be beneficial even in schizophrenia. But this, as opposed to what I said before, you are not allowed to give with THC because THC causes psychosis. So CBD alone may be antipsychotic, but when talking about prevention of addiction, it's very important because sometimes in the relapse period, some of the patients or some of the post-addiction phase patients become psychotic. And CBD may have also a very good option of treating that. In preclinical models, CBD by itself does not have hedonic properties. THC does, which is sometimes not sometimes, the main reason to use recreational cannabis is because of the THC psychoactive properties. CBD does not have this and does not have any hedonic properties, so the abuse potential of CBD alone is much less. The administration, repeated CBD administration is very important to reduce the cue-induced heroin-seeking behavior. Seeking behavior of the drug is something that you need to treat when talking about drug addicts. If I remember correctly, one of the questions to the previous lecturer was how many times, or do you take CBD or cannabis on a daily basis in order to treat patients? So at least for the first few months, you have to take it on a daily basis. Okay, in order if you want to treat patients, but the target or the efficacy accumulates within the first few weeks and reaches a plateau somewhere around 3 months. As I said before, it inhibits the relapse, and it's the suggested mode of action, and its only suggestion is through the glutamate receptors, but there's no specific proof that it works that way. We know that cannabis in general has a very strong interaction with both GABAergic terminals and glutamate terminals. I'm always asked whether it's a relaxing agent, cannabis, or how do you say, mamritz, gives energy, and the answer depends what inhibits. If it inhibits glutamate, which is an energizing sort of transmitter, then you get it, then it relaxes you. If it inhibits gamma amino butyric acid, which is usually a relaxant, then it makes you more energetic. And that's the difference between patients and people, and we don't exactly know who reacts to what until we try. But remember, trial and error is very important in medicine all the time. Here what I wanted to show, and I know that it's hard reading that, is that the cue-induced craving, when you use placebo versus CBD, you can see the difference. When using CBD, the cue-induced craving is much less, which helps. Cue-induced is when you, how many of you smoke cigarettes? Oh, no, nice, a low proportion. Most of us, when we smoke cigarettes, it's usually on cue-induced, after the first coffee, in the end of meal, social smoking. All of those are considered cue-induced, and CBD lowers that. If we look at the general craving, things are much more obvious. When using CBD, already in the beginning, after 24 hours, while in placebo there's still a craving, using CBD, and the craving has subsided, and after 7 days, it subsided even more, although already after 7 days of not using the drug, there's also a lowering of the craving of the patient itself. When you talk about cue-induced anxiety, since CBD treats anxiety and it's an anxiolytic, you can see that the patients are much less anxious than those using a placebo. And it's again very important because one of the reasons that you use drug is to escape reality. And what do you actually want to escape when you escape reality is to escape the depression or the anxiety. And if you lower the anxiety by some medication, and for that reason, at this point, CBD is a medication, or you use it medically, then you help the patient not use the heroin or the opiate again. And as I said, the main problems that we see now in addiction are pain management. And those are the numbers with the problem with pain management. The drug overdose has quadrupled in the last approximately 10 years. And it's the leading cause of death before motor vehicle accidents, or in the States before gun arm accidents. And the main problem, of course, are the synthetic opioids, which you probably know under the name of OxyContin or oxycodone or things or names like that. And you can read the numbers by yourself, and it's becoming more and more a problem around the world, at least the Western Hemisphere. And it's become such a great problem that the first time since, I think, 20 years, 1983, the US nation's life expectancy has declined. We're talking numbers of 2016. As you can see, life expectancy has declined in 2015, from 78.9 in 2014 to 78.8 in 2015. It's a small decline, of course, but it's the first time in over 20 years that there's been any decline. Usually it goes up. And part of the reason that the CDC, the Center of Disease Control, mentioned as causing that problem is the death from using opiate-based medicines. When talking to patients receiving cannabis, and at least in Israel, as far as I know, all around the world where there's a medical cannabis program, most of the patients use the cannabis for pain relief. Over 90% of the patients use it due to pain, chronic pain. And most of them said that cannabis improved the state so much that they did not have to use any other medication. 97% of the sample strongly agreed that they were able to decrease the amount of opiates. So much that in Israel, when prescribing cannabis to a patient, the doctor has to say what he expects as a good results. And part of the pain doctors state that the lowering of using of opiate medication is a good result, is a reasonable result to have. And they show it, and we have the numbers to show this is something that is going all around the world, not only in Israel. 81% agreed that taking cannabis by itself was more effective than the opioids, but remember the patients that it helped. This is just to show what you can do in order to treat opioid addiction, but the main thing is actually those numbers. The source, something happened to it. It's from Health Affairs in June 2016. Health Affairs is one of the most known journals concerning health economics. And it had a specific article on the use of cannabis in the states where the medical cannabis were allowed, as opposed, I'm talking about the US states that medical cannabis were allowed, and to the states where medical cannabis was not allowed. And they checked only what's called Medicaid patients, which means patients over 65. And they showed that every one of those, there is a reduction in the use of medicines, of other medicines, in people using cannabis. And you can see the percentage. For instance, anxiety, there's nearly 20% lowering the amount of using. In depression, 25%. In pain, 25%. Of course, the interval, what we call the relevancy interval, is big on spasticity, very small on pain, which means that the results for pain are much more accurate. But as you can see, in general, there's a reduction of using all kinds of medication. We are speaking now specifically about the pain medication. If you want to see the numbers of money saved, you can see it in billions of dollars each year, not per state, but per the entire US. And just think what even the US can do with that money for the benefit of the citizens. Money being saved on using, how shall I say, unwanted medication, unneeded medication. And the conclusion is that many patients thought of it as a better option than opioids. It's not, has its own dangerous side. I'm not saying that that you have to miss the problems with using cannabis. It has some kind of addictive properties by itself, and you have to look out if the patient uses too much cannabis and becomes what we say amotivational. But in general, it doesn't cause death. There's no one showed death due to the direct use of cannabis. I'm not talking about motor vehicle accidents or driving under the influence. But as opposed to, you can't OD on dying, okay? And in cannabis, unfortunately, we can learn this lesson from from Colorado, because in Colorado, as you know, recreational cannabis became legitimate. And what we saw after that is a rise in a lot of children coming to the medical department, mainly, of course, the emergency room, due to cannabis intoxication. Also, besides talking about the negligence of the parents, the main thing that we saw, none of them have died, even in small patients. I'm not saying it's beneficial to get intoxicated, but they haven't died, which is a dangerous side effect of the opiates. And it's greater effectivity of relieving symptoms such as chronic pain, and that's why the conclusion is that cannabis substitution can be effective for harm reduction for those who aren't able to using drugs completely. Just to show that it's not only a figment of my imagination, I have two slides showing you that already universities in the state, this one is specific, has started to study medical cannabis as an opioid alternative. And the French Toast has already gave a lecture, submitted a report on the interactions between cannabinoid system and the opioid system and the benefits of moving to medically cannabis-based medications over opioids. Thank you very kind attention. I would like to address, before I finish, one question that was asked to the previous lecturer is what kind of cannabis medication should you give? Should you use oil or should you use smoking? And the main difference between oil and smoking, it's not the only one, is that how long does it work? While smoking, it works very rapidly to a lesser extent of time. If you swallow it, like oil, it starts working later, but to a longer period of time. When you talk about chronic pain or addiction, you want long is better. So you can, and you don't have, when you suffer from chronic pain, you don't have to wait for the pain. It doesn't signal anything. You know that you have a lumbar spine problem. You've got pain, it comes and goes. You don't have to wait for the pain. You can take the cannabis by oil 2 to 3 times a day and have no pain. If you have what's called bursting pain or acute pain, then you want something to relieve it quickly. So usually what we tell chronic pain patients is to use oil for the chronic use and to have a bit by the side for smoking when you have a bursting pain. But in general, we prefer to use oil, not only because of what I said, but also because you can never know what the flower has. Even if you know what the strain is supposed to have, in the specific flower bud that you get, you don't know what you have. While when using oil, at least in the batch, you know exactly the ingredients you have, or those you measured. As I said, we never measured all 40 cannabinoids. Usually they measure between 2 to 6 cannabinoids, which are the most important and most those that you find in the oil. Thank you very much.